Today is typically or classically in Advent what's called John the Baptist Sunday. He appears during Advent, usually on the second Sunday of Advent. And we have there's a beautiful stained glass of John the Baptist right there baptizing Jesus. You can take a look at later. I'm sure all of you have seen it. It's wonderful. And while preparing this sermon, I was trying to get a sense of Matthew and John the Baptist. And I pulled out an old dusty commentary. It was so old that the type was actually kind of faded. I had to use a light and a magnifying glass to read it. And stamped in the flyleaf was this phrase from the library of Terry E. Cole. Now, this immediately brought back pleasant and profound memories. This was the clerk of presbytery in the Presbytery of the Redwoods. The Presbytery of the Redwoods is a long, thin presbytery that goes from Marin County up to Humboldt County. And up at the top of the Presbytery of the Redwoods, where it's Scotia, Fortuna, Garberville, etc., it's truly a wilderness. In fact, you see this picture on the front here of the tree cut down and then the flower. Terry was kind of like that in that he was a pastor who served up in the northern part of the presbytery. Well, I served, and he was also a clerk. Well, I served in the southern part. And Terry and I became very close for many reasons. And he was a throwback, in a sense. As I said, my presbytery had Marin County at the bottom, so it was kind of the Mercedes-Benz driving types, and up at the top were the four-wheel drive types. That was Terry. And Terry was both a hunter and a smoker. Now, I hunted because I had just transferred from Idaho to Redwoods, so we became friends and we used to talk about hunting. And if you want to get a picture of what Terry looked like, think of a sort of a young Clint Eastwood when he didn't shave. That's what Terry looked like. And his voice was like that too. So anyway, I used to kid Terry because we were the only two people in the presbytery among pastors who had ever owned guns and ever gone hunting. And so I used to rib Terry whenever we got together for a presbytery meeting. I used to say, jokingly, have you killed anything lately? And he would tell me about his various hunting trips. Well, on his last day of service as clerk of presbytery, he was outside smoking. He was also the only person who smoked in the entire presbytery. So he was outside smoking on the last day, and many of you have been to presbytery meetings. And so as the presbytery came, there's chimes or bells that often ring, meaning it's time to go in for presbytery. And Terry and I were outside smoking, and he was kind of getting ready to put out a cigarette. And I had just asked him, I just gone up and said, Terry, I've got to ask you, have you killed anything lately? Well, right then, right from where the auditorium where the presbytery met, and we were outside, this kind of do-gooder came running out and said to Terry, Terry was sitting there looking at me and said, Terry, the bell has rung. You better come in. And then he ran back in. And Terry looked at me and he said, I haven't killed anything today yet. He was unhappy about being called in, so being scolded. So as I said, Terry was very much, the reason I bring him up, he's very much like John the Baptist. He lived out in the wilderness. He had a gruff and powerful voice. He was very direct. He was clear about what his limits were when he was at a Presbyterian meeting and he couldn't arbitrate a rule. Like we're having a meeting tonight, so sometimes, or this after church, and sometimes in these meetings you have to arbitrate rules, and I'm sure Lynn does that for us. Terry did that in Presbytery, and if he didn't know what the rule was and he did thorough research, he would often look it up during breaks or lunch at Presbytery and try and get back to us. So he knew his limits. He was very humble. He was very direct. He was very dutiful. He knew the law and he lived it out. And so he was kind of a special person in my mind. And because Terry was like John the Baptist, complex, humble, dutiful, and direct. If he disagreed with somebody, he was not afraid to say it. John the Baptist, like Terry, was complex. Jesus said that John was the most important prophet that ever lived. That's quite something. John was complex. He ate locusts and wild honey and dressed in camel's hair skin. Now in Santa Cruz, that wouldn't be an unusual sight, but most places that would be odd, okay? He preached out in the desert, like Terry. Terry lived way out in the northern part of our presbytery, in the Fort Bragg area, and went hunting in that area. And John was a relative of Jesus, yet he was very unlike him. You know, Jesus says of John, and this is fascinating, Jesus said, John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man, Jesus referring to himself, came eating and drinking, and they say, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So in other words, John was a quiet, introverted guy. Jesus was an outgoing person who enjoyed the company of people. So, and then Jesus said this about John. What did you go out in the desert to see? A soft person dressed in fancy clothes? Now, Terry never dressed in fancy clothes, and years ago, people used to dress more formally. Terry always wore Levi's and kind of a plaid shirt. And so Jesus said, what did you go out in the desert to see when you went to see John? Did you want to see somebody who was dressed fancy, who was a soft, sophisticated person? He said, people like that live in castles. Or in my presbytery, they would have lived in the southern part of the presbytery. He said, John was not like that. And then John said of Jesus, I'm not worthy to carry the sandals of the one who comes after me. John and Terry were both really humble, and they both told the truth, the raw truth, even when it was unpopular or dangerous. Remember, John criticized Herod for what he considered an illicit marriage according to Jewish law. And John lost his life over that by attacking the political power, Herod, for immorality. He was killed for that. So Terry was very direct. I remember, and this had an impact on me, when I had been in Idaho, then I came to Redwoods. It was one of my first calls, or my second call, and one of the other pastors was giving a talk on how ministry should go and advice and so forth. And it wasn't clicking with me. You know, I wasn't catching on to what that pastor said. So I was having lunch with Terry, and I said, Terry, I'm a little worried. I couldn't comprehend or catch up with what that person was trying to explain, and so I'm worried that I'm having trouble comprehend him, And then Terry leaned way forward and he said, perhaps you're not the problem, Larry. In other words, what the guy was saying was, Terry said that what the guy was saying, I said, what? He said, you don't need to listen to what he's saying, you're fine. So he was very direct. So, in fact, when John was in prison, he sent some of his disciples to Jesus. Now, this is direct. John sent disciples, and he told them to ask Jesus, are you the one, or should we seek another? That's pretty direct to your cousin, like, hey, you're kind of disappointing, And then Jesus answered, go back and tell John what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. So, that's a direct thing. Now, one of the great mysteries concerning John the Baptist, is Jesus' remark in Matthew 17 following the Mount of Transfiguration. Remember, he saw in a vision, he saw Elijah and Moses, and then the disciples, when they were coming down the mountain, asked Jesus, they said, well, why do the prophets say that, or the religious scholars say, before the Messiah comes, Elijah must appear? And Jesus said, if you can accept it, He has come already. He was John the Baptist. Now that's a mysterious statement. I've always thought, was John in the spirit of Elijah? Was he reincarnated in Elijah? Was he just a prophet like Elijah? Probably that's most likely, because they were both prophets who challenged people, both prophets who helped people. Remember, Elijah helped the widow of Zarephath, and John encouraged people. He told them what to do to live rightly, in Luke especially. So, and then John made such an impression on people that he appears in all four Gospels. Not that many things are in all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And incredibly, John's disciples are mentioned as far down as Acts 9, the chapter 19 in the book of Acts. And even today, there's a small group of people who believe, who worship John the Baptist. You know, I think it's in the Middle East somewhere. I think Iraq or Iran. It's hard to keep track there because of the political instability, but there was recently a group that did that. So John had an impact on people for generations, just like Terry had an impact in me. So during this Advent, I'd like us to think, I'll be like Wayne here, can anybody think of a mentor who helped them? I would say Wayne has helped me when I've listened to his sermons. And there's always someone who helps us, like John, to prepare the way of the Lord, to make every path straight, every valley, flatten out every valley, conquer every hill. There's always someone who encourages us. And I have to say that Lorraine and I have been greatly, greatly encouraged by the faithfulness and the dutifulness and the love of everybody at this church. When we get to the annual report, you're going to see, well, you probably know what everybody has done to make this church happen, to prepare the way of the Lord. And we thank you for that. Everyone thanks you for that. Amen.